Alright, so today I want to cover 10 things that I wish I knew before I started breeding rats. I breed rats here in my collection as a food source for my ball pythons. And I started breeding ball pythons about 6 years ago, and I found out really quick after I got a few ball pythons that if you actually go to the pet store to buy some feeder rats for your ball pythons, it can be extremely expensive. And let me tell you, if you're planning on breeding ball pythons, you may want to consider breeding your own rats. And when I first started out, I decided, alright, I'm just going to try some rats. I actually bought 6 rats. I bought 2 males and 4 females just for some genetic variety as far as the start of my colony. And let me tell you, over the last 5 years, I probably produced tens of thousands of rats. It's amazing how prolific those rats can be. And I learned a lot of things along the way. So what I want to do is I want to show you, I actually moved my rats into a rat rack about 4 years ago. I actually started them in glass aquariums, moved them over to the rat rack. I wanted to show you the rack and show you the top 10 things that I wish I knew before I started breeding rats. Alright, so here is my rat rack. This is where I keep and breed all my rats, and I actually have another rack that is completely empty at the moment. I just have all my rats in here. This is actually made by ARS Caging, and it's not a complete rack. You can actually buy the levels individually. You can buy a partial rack, and the problem with this is if I had, more levels on top, the water wouldn't fit on top. And essentially the way these racks work is you actually have these tubs where you keep your rodents in, and in the tub I actually have a pine bedding as the substrate, and then for the food I put a little bit of food here between bedding changes, but most of the food is in trays on the back, and they actually come up through the bottom and eat the food out of the back, which is really awesome because they don't soil the food when they're kind of walking around in the tub here. And then as far as the water, they actually have like a pressure activated valve here on this. Is completely automatic, and then the lines go all the way up to a water reservoir up on the top, and you can actually see the water level, which is really nice as far as keeping track of the water. And then the food, you can just walk around the back and look at the food. So I actually made a list of 10 things I wish I knew before breeding rats. And probably number one, I'd say, is that I underestimated how difficult it is managing the production of rats in a rack like this. And you wouldn't believe how many rats you can produce in this. It's pretty amazing. So sometimes I actually have like 150 ball pythons. I'd say probably about 100, anywhere from 50 to 100 ball pythons in my collection. And say, for example, if you had 100 and every ball python ate once a week, you actually need 400 rodents a month to feed your ball pythons, which is insane. That is a lot. And then you figure, all your ball pythons are different sizes. You have small ones, you have your grow-outs, you have your adults. So now you need the right size rodent for every ball python every single week. And let me tell you, when you first get into this, it's completely maddening trying to figure it out. And essentially what I do is I get to the point where I produce more rodents than my snakes will eat. And then I'll take those rodents, I'll euthanize them with CO2 and put them in the freezer. So I'll have kind of an excess in the freezer. And when I run out of enough rodents of the right size here, I go back to the freezer and I have plenty there. I actually have 2 freezers full of rodents. And let me tell you, that solves all my problems as far as, I actually got into a point it was a couple months ago where I was running out of larges as far as enough in the freezer. I completely ran out. I didn't have any in my rack. So then, you have to gross them up and get them to a large size, kind of fill the freezer for an excess so you have some, which is let me tell you, you can rack your mind going over these. So what I'm doing right now is, if you kind of wrap your mind around some of the organization that I'm going through right now. So I'm pairing up my ball pythons. I've been pairing them up for about 2 months, and my females are going to start going on a fast, meaning I have like 20, 25 females that are going to stop eating, and most of my males. So that brings me down to almost not needing anything as far as rodents. I can feed them out of my freezer. So in the off season, like right now, what I'm actually doing is I'm taking my males and I'm separating from my females, and I'm letting the females have all their babies and wean them and kind of just, finish out their cycle. And then, like these males and females here, they're so old. Take a look at this male. This male is super old. And they get to the point where they're about I'd say about 2.5 to 3 years old, and they're pretty much at the end of their lifespan as far as being old. And if you can actually look at this one, he's kind of like a scruffy rat. You can tell he's kind of losing his coat, and they stopped producing. So he was actually with 2 females, and those 2 females, the last batch of babies, they only had 2 babies, and you can tell they get to the point, like this rat right here, if I was to like just keep him separate in a tub for another 6 months, he would probably die of old age because he's so old. So he's kind of earmarked for my reticulated pythons. And then what I do is I take a couple babies and I put them in here. I was actually, for a while, I was actually doing 2 males, 2 females, and 1 male as far as pairing them up. But the problem is if both females have babies, there's so many babies. There's like, you know, they both have like 16 babies. There's like 30 babies all over in here, which is way too many rats. So I'm just going to do 1 and 1. So if they have 16 at a time, it'll actually not be overcrowded. And then it was just too many rats. So I'm just doing 1 and 1. And it seems like it's kind of empty now. But once that female has some babies, let me tell you that it fills the tub completely. And then you have to kind of pull the babies out and grow them up in separate tubs. So you always want separate tubs with, you know, your holdbacks and your babies and your pairs and your males and your females. For a while I was actually writing it all down on a sheet and trying to figure out the organization because it gets a little bit overwhelming. All right, so that is number 1. Number 2, one thing I found out that I wish I knew at the beginning is how easy a rack is versus glass tanks. I actually started in glass tanks, and if you actually look at these tubs, it's so easy compared to a tank, because in a glass tank, I had glass aquariums that were almost the same size as this as far as breeding my rats. And the problem is usually in a glass tank, you have your water bottle, you have your food dish, you have a hide, and you have all this stuff inside that when you go to clean it, you have to take everything apart, and then like every couple days you have to, like almost every day, you have to check all your water bottles and everything. On this one, you don't have any water bottles, nothing to clean, you just dump out the tub. And I found the easier it is to clean these tubs, the more often you will clean them, because it's just so quick to go through this rack. And essentially what I do is I go through, and when I clean tubs, I put these little clips on them. So I clean these 5 tubs, 6 tubs last night, and then tonight I'll go through and clean the rest of the tubs down here. And I kind of have the schedule where I'll clean part of the rats over here and part down here, and then I'll clean the mice, and then I'll check on the spot clean the snakes, and I'll just kind of go through this whole schedule of cleaning. Every single night I just clean a few tubs, so it's not everything all at once. So that is pretty easy. Tanks versus the rack. So number 3, how toxic some bedding is. So this is kind of crazy. When I first started in rats, I was going crazy trying to find the right substrate for my rats. So I was going through like a cypress mulch and a whole bunch of different things. And I finally went to this pine bedding. You can actually look over here. These guys, these holdbacks are almost big enough to start having some babies, which is kind of cool. So I actually started with a whole bunch of different substrate. I went to one type of pine that was super toxic. It wasn't a kiln dried pine, and I found out about the pine toxicity a little bit too late. Oh my, it was kind of weird. It seemed like almost every day I was throwing out at least 1 dead rat through my whole rack, and you can, you know, after a while you can smell when you have a dead rat. It's like, oh no, I have another dead one. And for a while I thought I had some disease running through my collection, and I was running antibiotics through it and doing a whole bunch of stuff trying to figure it out. You know, all my rats, it wasn't like they were all dying, but every day I'd have a couple die out of, you know, 100 rats or something in there. And then I finally found out it was the bedding, and then I switched to like cypress mulch and a whole bunch of different things. And actually at one point I switched to shredded newspaper, which I found out was even more toxic to my mice. You definitely don't want to use shredded newspaper. And then I finally went down to Denver, and there's a pet store down there that was breeding rats, and he was like, hey, actually I've been using this bedding for years and years and years, and this is what it is. This is what I use. I don't even know if you can get it online. It's the Rocky Mountain Softwood Shavings. A lot of people have asked me, I think this is just a local product here, but this stuff has been working fantastic. I haven't lost any rodents since I started using it. So really, you need to find the right bedding that doesn't break the bank. You know, for a while, you can actually go to like some of the hardware stores and get some really good bedding, but it'll cost you like, it'll cost you, $100 to change all the bedding in all your tubs, and it's not worth it at that point. You'll actually break the bank if you don't use the right bedding. Then this stuff is real cheap. I think it's like $7 for a compressed bag, and a whole bag will do like the whole rack or something, so that's pretty good. All right, number 4, attention is required when the tubs are dirty. So that is another problem. If you got a busy schedule, you have to go somewhere and do something, and then you get to the point where all your tubs are dirty and they're starting to stink. Let me tell you, you need to go through and clean them. You have to kind of scrap everything on your schedule and do your tubs. That's kind of the crazy thing about rats and mice. You really can't wait and put it off, otherwise it gets really super bad. So number 5, they actually get too big for a ball python. So that is another thing that's kind of a disadvantage of rats. So the other thing is if you actually go through and you retire your females and your males and you bring them to the pet store and you're like, hey, I have these frozen thawed, these frozen males and females, will you give me some money for them? And a lot of times they'll buy all your rodents, except a lot of times they won't buy all of your really big jumbo rats because there's not that much of a demand for them, at least here in Colorado. So that's why I bought my reticulated pythons. Even my reticulated pythons can't keep up with how many jumbo rats that I use. So that is one thing. So number 6 is the potential for diseases. So if you're using this as a food source and you get a disease, you could potentially have a problem feeding your snakes, and then you'd have to buy like frozen ones through the mail or something. So number 7, females will have babies too early if left with the males. So for example, if I'm actually, so as a matter of fact, you can actually look in this one. So this one I actually haven't cleaned yet. And see, here's kind of the problem with the rats. So they'll actually have babies while you still have these small babies. So this one tonight, I'm actually going through all these tubs tonight, and you have these really tiny newborns, which a lot of times you need to pull them out and put them with another rat. So that's what I do, is I actually go through, instead of moving the males and the females around from tub to tub, I'll actually pull out some of the newborns that have a lot of different sizes in there, and I'll put them over with another one. So I actually have this one over here. I can actually show you this one. So these are my really old females that are about ready to retire, and she only had 2 little babies up here. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take those little tiny babies and put them over here. So that's one of the things. If you keep the males and the females together all the time, they'll have newborns before the other ones are completely weaned. So it gets a little bit confusing. So for example, these tiny ones over here, that's the other thing, is if you actually take a look at these guys, these little tiny ones, like especially this guy right here. So this little tiny rat, if I can actually get them up here, so cute. And that's the other thing, is they're so cute. This rat right here is not weaned, so you definitely don't want to pull this rat away from mama. I actually did that at the very beginning when I first started. I'd take this, I'd be like, oh yeah, he can survive on his own, and I'd put it in a separate tub, and they will just waste away because they're not weaned. They still need milk from mama at that point. They really need to be bigger than that before you move them. So it gets a little bit confusing actually working with all these rats. All right, number 8. One thing I wish I knew, rats don't bite if you move slow. So if you actually go in here, you notice on a lot of these rats, I can actually pick them up. And sometimes I get to the point where sometimes I'll go in and feed them table scraps. I haven't been feeding them table scraps for a long time. I don't know if these guys have eaten table scraps for quite a while, but normally if you go in here, move pretty slow, you will not get bit by a rat, which some people are kind of afraid of getting bit. And if you actually are really moving fast and chase them around, you'll actually, you don't want to scare them, you don't want to make them mean. If you just move really slow and gentle with the rats. I've never actually been bit by a rat where it broke the skin, which is pretty awesome. All right, so number 9, one thing you really don't want to do is add a new male to a female with babies. So for example, Let me show you another tub. I got some of these dirty tubs I don't want to clean tonight. This is another dirty tub. So for example, on this one, take a look at this. So these guys are getting to the point where they're big enough to be weaned, and then I have some smaller ones in here. So you actually, what I do with the ones that are big enough to get weaned, I put them in a baby tub. But as far as a male, so for example, if you took this male here and put it in with especially this one right here. So this one with the little tiny babies all over the place. If you put a male in here while that female still had babies, they would fight to the death. It would get really bad as far as fighting. It's the only time I've ever seen rats fight really bad is if you take a strange male and you put it in with a female tub with babies. And other than that, you can keep, you know, I actually had whole tubs with all males, whole tubs with all females. No problem with fighting at all. You can mix and match males and females. The only time you don't want to do it is when you put a male in with a female that there's no males in the tub and she has babies, and it can be pretty bad if you do that. I've done it once. I definitely won't do that again. All right, so number 10. Number 10, you definitely need a balanced diet when you're working with these rats. So when I first started with rats, there's really two expenses. There's the bedding, which is probably the most expensive thing, and then you have the food. And when I started, I actually was going to the feed store and I was buying all this different food. And I finally ended up, you can actually see these little, there's a whole bunch of dust all over the place. This, like, the food dust gets everywhere. But these are the little, you can actually buy it in 50-pound bags. This is the Missouri 6F Rodent Pro. It's like a rodent, it's specifically formulated for rodents. You actually put this in the bins in the back, and they actually go up and eat it. And when I first started with rats, I was actually going to the feed store, and I was buying bags of dried corn and wheat and all this stuff. I was actually using like pig chow, and I take all that stuff and I blend it together to make this mixed diet of all these different things I got to the food from the food store. You can actually go to the feed store and you can actually buy like a 50-pound bag of corn for like $7 or something like that, versus this stuff it's like $25 for a 50-pound bag. But the problem is with an unbalanced diet, your rats will get really super fat, and then they'll look kind of like that old male, like really scraggly, and they'll look really, really bad, and they'll pass away really early before they live out their full life, and they only live like 2 to 3 years. So if you actually use a really bad diet, you can expect even less than that, even half of that, which is kind of crazy. So I definitely invest in a good diet, and the cheapest bedding you can get as far as something that's not going to be harmful to your rats. So that was kind of a long top 10, but that's what I do for my rats, and that's kind of some of the challenges and the 10 things that I wish I knew when I first started breeding rats. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.